The first step that we recommend if you are planning your SAP PIPO to Microsoft Azure Logic Apps migration is to build a testing library that is based on your existing SAP PIPO messages. Once this is done, you can migrate the SAP PIPO test cases to the Azure Logic Apps test cases. As a next thing, you can do the migration of the SAP PI interface to the Azure Logic app. And then once this is done, you can execute previously migrated test cases to the new Azure Logic app and validate whether the SAP PO result is the same as the results generated by the test message in the Azure Logic app. In the first step, you can go to the test case robot for SAP PIPO to create test cases out of your existing SAP PI interfaces. In the robot, you can define specific information like the interface name of the existing SAP PIPO message, selection criteria, and the place where the folders and test cases will be created. Once you have all of those information, you can execute the robot that will automatically create test cases out of your existing SAP PIPO messages. As a next step, you can go to the API Tester Cockpit to the folder where Robot created the test cases for your SAP PIPO interfaces. Now you can select all of the previously created test cases and you can migrate them to the Azure Logic Apps. As you can see, 5 new test cases have been created. Now we can select the test cases that we want to run directly in the Azure Logic Apps. Now we can click Execute Selected button to inject the messages on the Azure Logic Apps. Let's see whether the messages are available in the Azure Logic Apps. In the Azure portal, we can open the Logic Apps to check whether in our Logic app we can see 5 newly sent messages. Now we can go back to INT4 Shield. As you can see in the INT4 Shield results, we can also see that all test cases passed. If we will jump into the details of the specific test case, we will not only see the details of the message or the details of the endpoint where we have sent the message, but we will see the validation of the new message created on the Azure Logic Apps and its results. On the left-hand side, we can see the original response from the message taken from the SAP PIPO output, and on the right-hand side, we can see the message output from the Azure Logic Apps. As you can already see, there are some differences that are expected due to the type of the interface that we are testing. All of the details like the payload validation ignore list or the endpoint where we are sending the messages to the Azure Logic Apps are defined in the automation object. Here, first of all, we have the definition of the logic app on the Azure side. Next, we have the payload validation ignore list that will be treated as warning. In our case, this was the sales order and the note in the payload. Finally, at the parameters side, we can see from which action we take the input to inject the message and from where we take the output payload. Down below, you can also see the direct HTTP URL. That is the endpoint where INT4 Shield sent the message for testing. Thanks to the fact that we are using existing PIPO messages for our test cases and that everything happens automatically, we can test our migration to Azure within hours and not months.